Welcome to the second part of Redefining Normal, Textual and Visual Rhetoric of Women with Disabilities, my project on the intersectionality and representation of female bodies with disabilities in the form of language, rhetoric, and visual rhetoric of still image advertising. My name is Hannah Sincavage, and I am a senior writing and linguistics major at Georgia Southern University with a concentration in rhetoric and composition and a minor in economics. If you are new and were pulled in by the great title, but have no clue what I'm talking about, you should watch the introduction first, which you can find by following the link in the description. This video is going to analyze and scrutinize the language that is attached to people with disabilities, used by both abled and disabled people, and the government. The language attached to objects and ideas ultimately influences how we feel about them and represent them. Also, I am making this video in the United States, and all of my examples and artifacts are from and created by Americans. So that is the society that is influencing our rhetoric and normalized ideals used in today's video. In the last video, we contextualized disability itself, as well as really set up the theory that we're going to use for this project. Notably, intersectionality is the discrimination that occurs because of intersecting identities. We also discussed the idea of the normal and normalization, which is society's rejection of anything that they perceive as abnormal. Feminist theory of role-taking and patriarchal power have an effect in society. And visual rhetoric is finding meaning in images and their purpose, composition, and context. You can find that video here, or there's a link in the description. Remember that according to the United States Census Bureau, 1 in 5 Americans are disabled, and more than 375,000 Americans become totally disabled every year. So chances are that what we talk about today directly affects either you or someone you know. There is no definite separation between abled or disabled, even though some people need to make this distinction. But these states exist on a continuum, and the choices that we make in regards to representing disability directly affect us all. I wanted to start the content videos with textual rhetoric because there is so much power in how we refer to people and in what we call them. To give context on the structure that shapes the society that creates this language, let's look at the language that academics and the United States government use to address and describe people with disabilities. Language is important in definitions, naming, and other aspects. So let's start with the government, where definitions determine policies in terms of gender and disability, and policies determine the daily experiences of people with disabilities. Phil Foreman, a professor at the University of Newcastle, tells us that the language associated with disability has changed over time, writing in the article Language and Disability that language relating to any concept will tend, over time, to acquire some of the concept's emotional impact. Thus, words that were, at one stage, neutral become laden with meaning. This changing emotional impact is shown in Rosa's law, a law passed by Congress in October 2010, which changed references to mental retardation in specified federal laws to intellectual disability, and references to a mentally retarded individual to an individual with an intellectual disability. Just take a moment and think about the fact that this was only 9 years ago, so the change is glacial, considering that in our current society, it's incredibly offensive to even allude to retardation. According to Mark Peters at the Boston Globe, the word was first used in a medical context in 1909 and became an insult in the mid-1900s. Nevertheless, the fact that our laws are reflecting social norms shows this progression and the rejection of emotionally laden words with negative associations. The word handicapped is another word that is slowly being phased out of laws and society. But back in the 1970s, words such as retardation and handicapped were being adopted to replace other words that had negative connotations, like mental deficiency, crippled, lame, imbecile, and invalid. As time passes, these words that were meant to be optimistic and inclusive inherently become attached to negative connotations and ridicule as seen with the word retardation eventually being phased out of our legislation because of its negative connotation. Normalization is society's tendency to force an ideal shape on all members. Carolin Ahlvik-Harju, from the Department of Theological Ethics and Philosophy of Religion at Abo Academy University, describes normalization, writing that the body is highly idealized and objectified in Western societies, and the social pressure to shape, regulate, and normalize one's body in order to fit a normative standard is strong. The normative body standard is defined by deeply rooted conceptions of normalcy, the normalcy narrative, and governed by a normalcy structure in culture and society. Every word that we use to describe disability and abnormal bodies inherently and eventually becomes negative because of the deep conception of normalcy. As Foreman reminds us, language will acquire some of the concept's emotional impact. Because society's normalcy narrative is so strict, any word that is associated with disability will pick up the feelings that are associated with what some see as abnormal bodies themselves. As depressing as that is, we have to recognize this cycle that is perpetuated by us and will continue to be upheld by us until we as a society choose to see differently, which is what this video is really about. There are ways to work against this system. We can attempt to make these negative words and phrasing more neutral rather than divisive. Although language is inherently attached to its object or concept, person-first language allows for there to be a separation between a person and their disability. An example would be saying a woman with Down syndrome instead of a Down syndrome woman. Although this may seem like the same thing to someone who is abled, this is the difference between being labeled a person or being labeled an illness. We see this use of person-first language exhibited in government documents, like this passage from the Social Security website. Many of you work tirelessly every day to provide service to individuals with disabilities. I thank you for making a difference in their lives. The Social Security Administration manages the Social Security Disability Insurance, which provides income supplements to people that the administration determines to be disabled. By including this quote in their message from Social Security, it is supposed to make people feel better about paying into Social Security, but it is also representative of the language and structure that we want to be using in relation to disability. The government is setting the expectations for what we should see in society around disability through the language of its policies. Let's see what the general public has to say about disability in the form of media. While the government policies and message discuss disabilities in a respectful way, the media we consume every day is much more passionate in order to connect with readers. The purpose is to compare the language of normal bodies and abnormal bodies in relation to abnormal bodies so that we can truly understand representation and the effect of normalization or society's power to get bodies to fit into a very specific shape. First, let's look at what people have to say about Bethany Hamilton. Bethany is an American surfer from Hawaii who lost her arm in a shark attack when she was 13 years old. To find these examples, I just typed her name into Google and looked under the news tab, so they're all fairly recent and represent our current society. Leah Schur wrote the headline, "Who is Bethany Hamilton? New details on the surfer who lost her arm to shark attack at 13, and the new documentary about her." I automatically responded well to this headline, because not only is there clear person-first language, but Schur chose to use words that were not as loaded. Instead of calling Hamilton a one-armed woman, armless, or amputee, like she's advertising a freak show and wants people to come in and see, she tells the story quickly and in as few words as possible. This is putting the disability in the background, and Bethany as the star, further shown when Schur writes, "She's sporty, she's literary, she's the one-armed surfer mom, Bethany Hamilton." Schur is using words that we can all relate to, like sporty, literary, and mom. This is normalizing who Bethany is and what her disability is, making the disability second to the person. I found this particular rhetorical approach consistent as I researched Bethany Hamilton, like this example from Mackenzie Mueller. surfer, shark attack survivor Bethany Hamilton to attend premiere of Unstoppable, which didn't even mention the amputation until the third paragraph of the article. And this started to confuse me. Maybe I'm just a cynic, but this respectful rhetoric goes against the normalcy narrative. Then I remembered intersectionality. Remember that intersectionality is the disadvantages or discriminations that are created from overlapping identities. Bethany Hamilton is a cisgender white woman born in the United States who, though disabled with an amputation, is still extremely athletic. This is Mama Cox, a cisgender Haitian American woman who is also disabled through an amputation, but because she had osteosarcoma, a malignant type of cancer. Now she works as a model. Now the question is if the rhetoric and language describing her is different from the rhetoric describing Hamilton because of their single differing identity of race. From Bored Panda, Veva writes, amputee woman who was given 3 weeks to live becomes famous fashion blogger. Even though both Hamilton and Cox lost their limbs in their adolescence, Hamilton was described as a survivor and Cox an amputee. This is a clear example of using both loaded language and person second language rather than person first. Veva chose the loaded word amputee and put it before a mention of Cox, so that will be the first image that we hold of her. This rhetorical approach is consistent, shown in this other headline from Metro, one of the biggest news brands in the United Kingdom. Miranda Larbi states, this amputee fashion blogger was given 3 weeks to live and is now giving everyone serious life goals. It doesn't matter that she has become a famous fashion blogger and model, she is still the amputee first. This is in direct contrast to the Hamilton headlines that established her career and personhood before mentioning her disability. The only notable difference between the two women is their skin. Cox's intersectionality of being a black disabled woman puts her at a disadvantage compared to a white disabled woman, epitomizing that whiteness is more normalized than blackness, and our rhetoric changes based on that. These examples with Hamilton and Cox were written for the purpose of getting people to read them. But the desperate need to make Bethany Hamilton seem normal, as well as the urge to make Mama Cox seem abnormal, are tendencies that are not limited to this form of media. The language that we say and use in conversations also shows our need to normalize, so that we can exercise some form of power through oppressing others. Lauren Baldwin, a woman with hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, writes about her conversations with people when she feels strong enough to walk instead of using her wheelchair. She says, "It occurred to me today when 5 people in one day expressed how happy they were to see me on my feet again, that people equate healing with walking. People know what the normal body is supposed to look like, and this regulates perceptions of health. As the scholar Carolin Ahlvik-Harju asserts, the body is highly idealized, and the social pressure to shape one's body in order to fit a normative standard is strong. Despite the fact that it could cause pain or discomfort to walk, it still looks healthier than using a wheelchair. This contributes to how people with disabilities see themselves. As Baldwin mentions, you see, I hated using a wheelchair at first. I saw being a wheelchair user the same as other people view me now, but my wheelchair is the reason I can still leave the house. Our society is conditioned to vilify the abnormal, the bodies that don't look or move exactly the way that we expect or want them to. So why does this matter? The language attached and associated with bodies with disabilities is used in an effort to normalize abnormal bodies. Although our society changes and replaces the actual words that we use, they come to mean the same thing and have the same connotations, because of the way we think and feel about disability. Remember the loaded language of Mama Cox's headline, "Amputee woman who was given 3 weeks to live becomes famous fashion blogger"? I'm sure that purpose of this woman was not to offend Cox, but that does not change the fact that what she wrote is offensive. This rhetorical approach shows society's need to point out what they see as abnormalities, and this can be avoided by educating ourselves on issues in terms of language. We can become aware of what could be considered racist, or ableist, or misogynistic, and stop using it. The language used to describe people with disabilities is not only dependent upon the person's ability, but also their other identities, as seen with Mama Cox and Bethany Hamilton. Through this distinction, it's seen that some people can be more normal than others, even if they hold similar identities, just as Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality predicts. But what can we do about this? How can we change this system that feels inevitable? That question we will start to answer in the next 3 videos, as we discuss the influence of image and representation on culture. The important thing that we must all understand is that words can make our culture seem more inclusive, but there will not be true change until our culture and the way that we see and represent people changes.